Russia is involved in a war, but it's not the war that you're thinking about. While the battle rages on inside Ukraine, there's another fight happening in Russia that threatens to cripple the country at its very core. This is a fight that is pitting some of Russia's most important institutions against each other, and it's a fight that has no winner, only one loser: Russia. Vladimir Putin's regime is devouring itself as war erupts between the FSB and Russia's military generals. The Kremlin is in chaos as the greatest threat now facing Russia comes from within. And it's all because Putin's Ukraine invasion is failing. That's according to political advisor and YouTuber Jason J. Smart, who highlights the sheer scale of Russia's losses against Ukraine. Since Russia invaded, it's lost territory inside Russia itself for the first time since World War II. It's gained between 10 and 20% of Ukraine's land since the initial invasion, and its latest attempted land grab, Putin's summer offensive, has collapsed. You can find out more about that collapse in our video. The last few years have cost Russia over 1 million casualties killed and wounded, tens of thousands of pieces of artillery, and thousands of tanks. The invasion that was meant to last a few days has turned into a debacle for Russia. And Russia's generals are paying the price. Since the invasion started, arrests of Russian generals have skyrocketed, according to Smart. Before the invasion, a general's arrest was quite a rare event, he says. There were only 2 generals arrested in 26 months before the invasion. However, after the invasion, that number has exploded to 19 in just 42 months. This explosion represents a 6-fold increase in generals being arrested. And the craziest thing about all of this is, it's all part of the plan, at least for one organization in Russia. But we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, 2025 has been a banner year for the arrests and prosecutions of Russian generals. In April alone, 2 of Russia's most important generals were sent down for crimes they've supposedly committed. The former commander of Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army, Major General Ivan Popov, was among them. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, reported on April 11th. He's been under arrest for almost a year and chose to exchange a lengthy prison sentence for a demotion and reintroduction into the Russian military. That demotion has sent him to one of Russia's penal assault detachments, which the ISW says is practically a death sentence for the general. Popov would have known this better than anyone. It makes you wonder what fate awaited him that led to his choosing a death sentence on the battlefield versus incarceration. Less than a week later, the BBC reported that another former top Russian general, Vadim Shamarin, has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for taking bribes. He was accused of receiving the equivalent of $443,000 between 2019 and 2023 from a Russian factory that received larger contracts as a result. But perhaps the most important military corruption-related incident to take place in Russia in the last years was the arrest of senior Ministry of Defense official Yuri Kuznetsov on May 14, 2024. The second official from the ministry to be arrested on corruption charges, he was apparently discovered with around $1 million in rubles, foreign currency, gold coins, and assets, all of which were found at his property. Kuznetsov is now on trial, and his charges could lead to him being imprisoned for 15 years. On the surface, all of these arrests, along with the many that Russia has carried out since it launched its invasion of Ukraine, seem legitimate. After all, these are generals who have been involved in fraud and bribery. Of that, there is no doubt. However, there's something much darker going on behind the scenes here. This isn't Putin or his cronies cleaning house in the Russian military to achieve success in the war. If it were, 19 arrests since the war started would have gotten Russia better results than those Smart highlighted earlier in the video. The real reason for these arrests is something that Putin doesn't want to consider. They're a power grab, an attempt by one agency inside Russia to strip the power and influence away from those who could stop them from taking control once Putin is out of the way. There is a war for survival going on within the Russian inner circle right now, and it's a war that Russia's military isn't winning. Just like their soldiers in Ukraine, the head honchos in Russia's military are constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing they could be the next to be removed from power by an agency that wants to take it all. That agency is Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB. And if everything goes according to the FSB's plan, it will hold Russia's reins of power sooner rather than later. Smart explains what's really going on here, using Kuznetsov's arrest as a prime example. He controlled, Smart says. He was the decision-maker of who would get which commands, who would get promoted, who would get clearances, who would get housing, who would get protection in the army. The corruption Kuznetsov was involved in is secondary to these facts. After all, corruption is part and parcel of Russian military life. You don't get to become a general by being a nice guy, Smart notes. You do it by taking bribes, stepping on others, and doing whatever you can to consolidate as much power as possible. But power makes people targets in Russia, especially when that power is held by a man whom the FSB can now question. With Kuznetsov in custody, the FSB has achieved 2 things. First, it's removed a powerful man from office, perhaps opening the door for it to influence a future appointment that will start making decisions that favor the FSB. Second, the FSB now has a chance to extract information from Kuznetsov that it can use to go after the power brokers in Russia's military. Bit by bit, the FSB is waging war against Russian military leaders, causing a collapse from within that's being reflected on the battlefield. Yes, Ukraine's amazing tactics and brave defense are playing huge roles in Russia's failures, but the chaos the FSB is creating inside the military hierarchy is setting the stage. Chaos at the top means disorganization at the bottom, a fact that Ukraine takes advantage of again and again. But let's backtrack for a moment. What is the FSB and why is it able to do what it's doing right now? According to Russia's government, the FSB is a federal executive body that has the power to implement governmental policy in areas of national security, counterterrorism, and the defense of Russia's borders. Essentially, the FSB is loosely a modern-day equivalent of the former KGB, the one that is more focused on internal security than overarching international intelligence. The FSB is also heavily involved in Russian cyber operations targeting other countries, says the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, making the organization a key component in the ever-growing Russian hybrid warfare machine. While all of this makes the FSB seem like an organization that's working in Russia's and therefore Putin's best interests, it's the very powers the FSB has that it's now turning against Russia's military. After all, senior Russian officials taking bribes that supposedly weaken the military is a matter of national security. According to Smart, the FSB is now using that power to position itself as the dominant force in Russian politics. Its strategy involves several steps, all of which it's executing brilliantly right under the nose of Putin and the Kremlin. First up, hollowing out the shell. The FSB strategy in these arrests is pretty simple, Smart says. They're going after the four pillars of the Russian military. Now, by capturing these levers, they leave the army as a hollowed-out shell, a shell that will not be able to fight back. The FSB started by going after those who are in charge of gatekeeping command and those who turn secrets into power. Kuznetsov is the perfect example of this, with Smart describing his arrest as a masterstroke by the FSB. The unofficial ledgers Kuznetsov kept of all his bribes and how they related to the decisions he made have become a treasure trove of information for the FSB. And it's the destruction of this pillar of the Russian military in particular that feeds into the second step of the FSB's strategy: compromat. CNN describes compromat as embarrassing materials that somebody intends to use against someone else. Of course, we have an English word for this very action: blackmail, or in the FSB's case, a specific type of blackmail in which it uses the materials it gathers as a form of currency, perhaps the currency that speaks loudest and is the most valuable in all of Russia. Almost every arrest that the FSB is making right now is providing it with compromat. Kuznetsov's arrest just happens to be one of the most valuable. The FSB now has blackmail on the entire officer corps of Russia, Smart points out. They can now control any general at any time simply by threatening to expose him. With the compromat it's gained as a result of its arrests, the FSB can also extort money, knowing that its targets will pay up because the alternative is that those targets go to jail. What, you thought the FSB was immune to the corruption it's supposedly targeting? No, not at all. According to Smart, if anything, the FSB is even more corrupt than the Russian military, as well as being far more adept at using the secrets it gathers while keeping its own secrets. With its compromat gathered, the FSB gains control over the money that's flowing through the Russian military, which leads right to the next step: cutting off the FSB's rivals. Not only does the FSB use compromat to influence decision-makers, meaning corrupt money flows to where the FSB wants it to flow, while also ensuring that military hires that favor the FSB are made, but it's also going after others who control cash flow. This time, Smart uses Timur Ivanov as an example. The former Russian Deputy Defense Minister Ivanov was arrested back in April 2024 under familiar charges, taking bribes. Notably, Ivanov was also an ally of former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who has himself been ousted from his position, albeit not arrested. Ivanov was an important man, Smart notes. In Russia, it's a person, a man, not a system, that approves payments, Smart says. Ivanov was in charge of approving military construction. In short, this means that Ivanov's signature controlled literally billions of dollars in contracts, which is why so many in Russia were keen to bribe him. Ivanov did take those bribes, as all of the others the FSB has arrested did. The very fact that he was corrupt is what allowed the FSB to oust him. But now Smart says all of the power that Ivanov once wielded has vanished. In 2024, the pipeline of money flowing through Russia's military construction industry froze up. The FSB created a problem only it could solve, Smart points out. So then the subordinates got very nervous. They then also worried that anything they signed could then lead to their own arrest, and they feared signing anything. Essentially, the FSB ground the wheels of Russian military construction to a halt, creating a vacuum of power that needed to be filled. And guess who just happened to be in a position to fill that vacuum? The FSB. That's the final step of the FSB's strategy. In the case of Ivanov, the FSB stepped in to fill the void he left behind, making it clear to the contractors with whom he used to work that the old boss was gone and there was a new boss in town. Of course, this also meant that the FSB gained control over the contractors that Ivanov previously oversaw. If they wanted to get any work at all, they would have to start working with the companies that the FSB dictated. And of course, these directives mean that the cash that once flowed into Ivanov's pockets, as well as the collective pockets of Russia's defense ministry thanks to bribes, is now being redirected. The FSB now gets all of that money in what Smart calls a full-spectrum assault on the military's treasury. It's an absolutely brilliant strategy. The FSB gets stronger thanks to its people and the new flows of cash. Russia's military gets weaker at the same time. And it's a strategy that the FSB is following to the letter again and again. It's already taken down the heads of Russia's logistics and military construction chains. Even medical procurement has fallen under the FSB's sway thanks to the August 26th arrest of Major General Konstantin Kuvshinov. Former head of Russia's 9th Medical and Diagnostic Center is now under arrest for allegedly embezzling $410,000 from the Russian state. Of course, the FSB doesn't really care about the embezzlement. What it cares about is the power that Kuvshinov held, which is now held by the FSB. Hollowing out, blackmailing, cutting off, and then filling the vacuum. These are the tools of the FSB trade, and it's been using them expertly throughout the Ukraine war, getting rid of military generals who might oppose it under the guise of tackling corruption, while being just as corrupt as the people it's taking down. All the FSB has to do is rinse, lather, and repeat. The FSB isn't the only organization involved in these complex political machinations that are designed to expand its power. These are all things they're doing to make sure that their opponents are neutered, that they will no longer pose a threat to them, that all cash will flow through them, Smart points out. That's happening across the country, and it's not just the FSB. Those with power are trying to consolidate it as fast as they can. It just so happens that the FSB is better at it than most, and it has the resources to pull off what essentially amounts to a quiet coup of the Russian military. Of course, this all brings us to the obvious question that has to be asked: why is the FSB doing all of this? The easy answer would be that it wants to benefit from the endemic corruption that has served many within Russia's military for so long. The entire Russian political system works on power and plunder, the Journal of Democracy pointed out in 2018, and it's this underlying system of nothing getting done in Russia unless somebody high up is getting a backhander that the FSB is benefiting from right now. Those within the FSB are just as corrupt as the people they're arresting. The same goes for almost every Russian institution. We have to understand that the police, just like the prosecutors in Russia, just like the FSB, are not interested in justice. They're interested in making money. Of course, police and prosecutors, along with courts and judges, are responsible for arresting and determining the sentences for the people the FSB is incriminating, meaning that the money that flows through these three organizations takes the FSB closer to where it wants to be. The more money the FSB gets, the more people it can take down. The only problem, as Smart points out, is that the cash pot is smaller than it used to be thanks to Putin's Ukraine invasion. With less money to go around, it's only the strongest who'll survive. The FSB's raids in particular give it immediate sources of cash, with the control over the positions of those it arrests ensuring a steady, long-term flow. So what you get is a vicious cycle that's killing Russia from the inside. As the New York Times noted in July, corruption cases often follow military failures. That's why we mentioned how Russia's devastating issues in Ukraine served as the trigger for what the FSB is doing right now. The FSB benefits when the Russian military fails because it can use these failures as excuses to launch the raids it's launching, even though it knows as well as everybody else in Russia's higher echelons that the bribes and embezzlement are all baked into the Russian system. Putin allows all of this to happen because the FSB purges relieve him of any responsibility for Russia's failures. But that's where the true masterstroke of the FSB's plan comes into play. The FSB isn't dismantling the Russian military from the inside for the fun of it. The organization has a very specific goal that we've touched on several times before: taking control of Russia. Smart suggests that many inside the FSB feel that Putin isn't longing for Russia's primary seat of power. There seems to be a lot of concern that there could be significant political changes in the immediate term, Smart says, before noting that everything that he's seeing happen inside Russia right now isn't normal. These sorts of purges and power plays always suggest that there are significant problems, and that problem may be Putin himself. There are hints that Russia's leader has at least started considering what the future of Russia will look like without him. In May, the Kyiv Independent reported that Putin apparently has a list of potential candidates to succeed him if he dies or chooses to relinquish the Russian presidency. But that list assumes that Putin will still be around to influence the decision that eventually gets made. There's a very good chance he won't be. Putin has already put down one military insurrection during the Ukraine war when he managed to subdue the rebellious Wagner group. The group's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, ended up suffering an unfortunate accident not long after his attempted coup. Russia is also rattled by a host of problems that are impacting it internally, all of which potentially weaken Putin's grip on power. Smart rattles those problems off one by one. It's worth noticing that all of this is happening on the backdrop of a country that's having significant economic problems, Smart says. The state budget is simply breaking. The state is failing to pay its workers. 13% of Russian households can now only afford to buy food, and it keeps on going. Volunteer enlistment has totally dried up. The state must now use threats to get people to join its military. Security teams are now raiding airports to find draft dodgers. None of this is normal for Russia, Smart concludes. And it may be this lack of normality that ultimately leads to the FSB seizing power from Putin. Everything that it's doing right now is designed so that the FSB has the leverage it needs to control everything when Putin is out of the picture. If Putin dies or leaves voluntarily, then great. The FSB now controls so many processes within Russia's military that it will have a heavy say in who gets appointed, effectively meaning it can install a puppet president. Worse yet for Putin, that military control, if it continues to grow, could eventually put the FSB in a position where it won't have to wait for Putin to leave office. The FSB could make that happen itself, and it'll do it knowing that it can point to the state of Russia caused by Putin's war and the failures of the military that's supposedly trying to clean up to make that happen. The purge has purpose. What Putin may not realize is that it's the FSB that may come out as the ultimate winner in the end. What we're seeing here is the most dangerous internal fracture Russia has faced since Joseph Stalin's era. And if you're interested in further examination of this fracture, check out our video, Putin Eradicates Generals While the FSB is Cannibalizing Russia. And if you like this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of what's happening inside Russia's military. And thank you for watching.